No one took the crying bride at the station until a rancher's son pointed. "That's my mama, Wyoming territory." 1891. The first light of dawn spilled over the lonely station like pale water poured across cracked earth. A single rail car groaned against the iron track, gave a final shudder, and slipped into the horizon with a sigh that felt almost human. The sound lingered, a hollow echo of iron against iron, before the prairie wind swallowed it whole. Clara May Hollis stood where the shadow of the departing train once lay. Her veil, snagged on a splintered post, trembled like a wounded bird in the cold breath of morning. The prairie wind caught the hem of her dress, lifting it enough to show boots still dusted from 3 states of travel. A suitcase gaped at her feet, one latch broken, spilling a ribbon of lace and a Bible, whose pages fluttered like the wings of some restless thing. The promise had been simple. A letter scrawled in a rough rancher's hand. A ticket west, a future carved out of Montana soil. But the platform stretched empty as a dried-up riverbed. No groom, no carriage, only dust and silence. Inside the station house, the ticket window slammed with a wooden finality. The station master, hat pulled low, spared her a glance, half pity, half warning, before retreating to the back room. His footsteps faded, leaving only the creak of settling boards and the whistle of a hawk circling high above. Clara bent to gather the scattered contents of her suitcase. Her fingers shook, not from cold, but from a humiliation so deep it burned. A stalk of her bouquet snapped beneath her grip. The brittle stem broke like a bone, white petals scattered across the platform, carried off by the same wind that had stolen her welcome. Coyotes called from the far hills, their mournful cries threading through the early light. Each note felt like a question she could not answer. Clara straightened, spine stiff despite the ache that threatened to fold her. Powdered rouge streaked beneath her eyes where tears had carved their slow path. She pressed a palm to her cheek, as if she could hold her dignity in place with sheer will. A door opened somewhere behind the freight wagons. 2 men emerged, boots striking gravel with the lazy rhythm of ranchers not yet bound to a day's work. One small and eager, the other tall and quiet. Elias Boone carried the kind of silence that filled a room before he ever spoke. Barely 20, but already shaped by the land. Shoulders broad, jaw set like the stone ridges beyond the town. He paused when he saw her. For a heartbeat, the wind seemed to lean in, curious. Beside him, a boy of maybe 8 tugged his sleeve. "Why is she crying?" the child whispered, voice barely louder than the prairie hiss. Elias said nothing. His throat felt scraped raw, as if the truth were gravel he had to swallow. He saw more than a stranger in a ruined dress. He saw a wound walking, a life uprooted and left to dry in the western sun. Clara sensed their eyes but did not turn. Her focus remained fixed on the far line of track, where the last curl of steam faded into the rising light. She told herself that another train would come, that the letter was only delayed, that men of honor sometimes lost their way but found it again. Lies tasted bitter, but they kept her upright. A gust of wind carried the scent of coal smoke and dry sage. It rattled the freight wagon chains and set the station sign to creaking. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the prairie breathe around her. Each inhale carried the grit of 1,000 miles. Each exhale the soft hiss of dreams unraveling. Footsteps approached, measured, deliberate. She opened her eyes to find the tall young man standing a few paces away. The boy lingered behind him, wide-eyed and silent. Elias removed his hat, the gesture slow, respectful. For a long moment he simply looked at her, eyes the color of river stones after rain. His gaze held no pity, only recognition, as though he'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Clara gripped the handle of her suitcase until her knuckles whitened. She expected words, questions, offers, judgments, but none came. Only the wind moved between them, carrying the faint cry of a hawk high above. Somewhere in that quiet, something shifted. A seed of understanding took root, fragile but stubborn as prairie grass after a fire. Clara didn't know the young man's name, nor he hers, yet both felt the pull of a road neither had planned to walk. The boy's small voice finally broke the silence. "She looks cold," he said. Elias's jaw tightened. He lowered his hat back onto his head and stepped back, leaving only the imprint of his boots in the dust. "Come on," he murmured to the child, the words nearly lost to the wind. They disappeared behind the freight wagons, but the echo of their presence lingered like the last hum of the departing train. Clara stood alone again, veil fluttering, heart pounding to a rhythm that felt dangerously close to hope. Far down the tracks, the sun climbed higher, gilding the rails with light. The day had begun, indifferent and vast. Somewhere beyond the hills, life waited. But for now, the bride remained on the platform, abandoned, unclaimed, yet somehow not defeated, as the endless prairie opened its silent arms. By mid-morning, the town lay beneath a cruel, unbroken sun. Clara moved through its dusty veins like a pale wraith, her torn veil trailing behind her like a stubborn ghost. Wooden boardwalks groaned beneath her steps. Each storefront reflected a piece of her humiliation. The saloon's swinging doors half open, spilling the bitter music of laughter and whiskey. The church bell striking noon, its metallic clang a hollow sermon on promises unmade. Men paused in their work to stare, cowhands leaning against corral posts. Shopkeepers pausing mid-sale, then quickly looked away, as if her shame might drift across the street and settle on their shoulders. Children whispered behind the water trough, eyes wide at the sight of a bride with no groom. The dry goods store smelled of kerosene and old cloth. Clara laid her folded wedding dress on the counter, its satin dulled by travel dust. "Train fare east," she said, voice steady despite the dryness in her throat. "How much will this fetch?" The merchant, a narrow man with tobacco-stained fingers, pinched the fabric between thumb and forefinger as though testing a carcass. "Quarter," he said at last without meeting her eyes. "A quarter? Best I can do. Folks don't buy dreams round here." Her stomach clawed with hunger sharper than pride. Still, she shook her head, gathered the dress back into her arms, and stepped into the blistering street. The door's bell jangled behind her, a cruel little laugh. Across the street, Elias Boone followed at a distance. His boots crunched against gravel in a rhythm older than words, the sound swallowed by the hot hush of noon. He carried the scent of sun-warmed leather and horse sweat, a quiet reminder of a world that still made sense. Yet his heart beat an unfamiliar cadence, slow, heavy, insistent. He remembered the birthing bed where his mother's breaths had thinned to a whisper. He remembered the silence that had devoured his father afterward, the way grief could strip a man of language until only the sound of boots on dry earth remained. Something in Clara's stillness carried that same haunted weight, and it pulled at him like a low tide. Afternoon bled toward evening, and the sky began to bruise. Purple clouds rolled over the hills, thick and swollen, dragging a copper taste into the air. The prairie wind sharpened, slicing through the streets and stirring the smell of rain long before the first drop fell. Clara felt it in her bones, a restless charge humming beneath her skin. She tightened her grip on the battered suitcase and searched for shelter as merchants shuttered windows and mothers called children inside. A flash of lightning split the distant ridge, illuminating the rail yard in a brief, silver gasp. The first needles of rain struck as she ducked beneath the freight awning of the station. Tin roofing rattled beneath the onslaught. The storm's breath carried the scent of wet iron and distant sage, a smell both wild and intimate. Clara set her suitcase down and wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep through the thin fabric of her dress. Thunder rolled low, like a drumbeat under the earth. Through the gauze of rain, she sensed a figure approaching. Boots on gravel, steady, unhurried. A shadow resolved into the tall young rancher she had glimpsed that morning. Hat pulled low, rain streaking his shoulders. Elias Boone stepped from the curtain of water as though the storm itself had shaped him. He stopped a few paces away, careful not to crowd her, yet close enough for the air to thicken between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Rain hammered the roof, a relentless percussion that made the silence inside feel sacred. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the rasp of gravel washed clean by rain. "You got a name?" The question hung there, simple and vast. Clara lifted her eyes. They were gray as storm clouds, endless and searching. Lightning flashed again, catching in the wet strands of her hair like tiny sparks. "Clara May," she said. The syllables dropped into the storm with the weight of carved wood. Solid, permanent, impossible to take back. Elias nodded once, as if he'd known all along. His eyes lingered on hers, steady and unreadable, like a river stone polished by years of silent current. The rain thickened, drowning out the world beyond the awning. For a heartbeat, they stood suspended in that private hush, two solitary fates tethered by nothing more than a name and the wild music of the storm. Somewhere above, A hawk cut through the bruised sky, its cry swallowed by thunder. The rain slanted harder, drumming a rhythm that neither could break. Clara felt the name settle between them like a seed pressed into fertile soil. Whether it would bloom or wither, the storm alone seemed to know. Morning broke hard and restless, the kind of day when dust devils rise without warning and gossip rides faster than any horse. By the time Clara stepped from the freight awning, the town already hummed with whispers. Runaway bride, white dress, no groom. A heart left bleeding on the station platform. Men loitered at corners, leaning against hitching posts with the lazy menace of predators too bored to hide their teeth. Drifters and cowhands turned their heads as she passed, eyes gleaming like coins in shadow. The scent of whiskey drifted from the saloon door, sharp as a blade's edge. One figure detached from the others, moving with the slow certainty of a man who has earned every scar on his face. His duster flapped in the dry wind like the wings of a dark bird. A bounty rider by the look of him, gunbelt worn smooth, carved from old violence. He stepped into Clara's path, boots sinking slightly into the grit. "Morning, bride," he drawled, breath steeped in cheap rye. "Looks like the groom lost his way. I could keep you safe." His gaze slid over her like oil. Protection don't come free, but nothing good does. The world seemed to tighten around her, the air tasting of rust and threat. Clara clutched her suitcase until the leather creaked. Behind her, bootsteps struck the street, steady, deliberate. Elias Boone emerged from the thin morning light, hat pulled low, his father's Colt hanging heavy at his hip. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. "She's with me." 3 words, flat and sharp as a blade drawn across stone. The bounty rider's smile curdled. He studied Elias with a predator's patience, then spat into the dirt. "Plenty of ways to get hurt, boy. Then start with me." Elias's voice carried no bravado, only the quiet certainty of a man who would not move. A heartbeat passed. The bounty rider's eyes flicked to the Colt, then back to the storm gathering in the young rancher's face. He gave a short, bitter laugh and stepped aside. "Ain't worth the bullets." Dust swirled around his boots as he vanished into the saloon's shadow. Clara released the breath she hadn't known she was holding. Elias turned to her, eyes steady but unreadable. "You shouldn't be here. Where else is there?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tipped his hat toward the open prairie. "Come on." They left the town behind, the last gossiping voices swallowed by the endless stretch of land. The Boone Ranch rose from the horizon like a weathered fortress, cedar posts blackened by years of wind, fences sagging where storms had tested their resolve. Cattle lowed in the distance, their cries carrying across the brittle grass. On the porch stood Jed Boone, a man built of rawhide and silence. His eyes, gray and cold as river stones, narrowed as the pair approached. The sight of the girl's white dress and his son's defiant posture told him more than words ever could. "This ain't a boarding house," he said, voice rough as barbed wire. Clara stepped forward before Elias could speak. "I'll work for food," she said, chin lifted though her hands trembled at her sides. "I don't need charity." Jed studied her the way a rancher studies a storm, measuring its power, its direction, the damage it might bring. The prairie wind carried a distant coyote howl, sharp and lonely. Dusk gathered along the ridges, painting the sky with streaks of blood orange and ash. Finally, Jed gave a single, reluctant nod. Chores start at dawn. The words settled like the first drops of rain before a flood. Clara lowered her eyes in quiet thanks. Elias exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the station. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and old grief. Shadows stretched long across plank floors scarred by years of boots and hard living. Jed disappeared into a back room without another word. The silence he left behind was heavier than any sermon. Elias led Clara to a narrow cot in the corner room. The blanket smelled faintly of cedar and horse. She set her suitcase on the floor, the battered leather dark against the pale boards, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, coyotes called to one another across the hills, their cries threading through the night like questions with no answers. The wind rattled the shutters, a restless percussion that seemed to echo the beating of her heart. Clara lay back, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, each line a road leading nowhere she'd ever meant to travel. Hunger gnawed at her, but exhaustion pressed heavier. Somewhere beyond the thin wall, Elias moved about the house. The soft scrape of his boots a quiet reassurance that she was not entirely alone. In his own small room, Elias sat on the edge of his bed staring into the dark. The scent of rain still clung to his jacket, mingling with the faint memory of her perfume, roses wilted by dust. His heart beat a rhythm he could neither name nor quiet, a promise forming in the silence. Fragile as new grass after fire, the wind rose once more, carrying the sound of distant coyotes, and the unspoken vow of a night that had only just begun. Weeks slipped by, like slow rivers wearing stone. Each dawn found Clara rising before the rooster, the chill of the prairie seeping into her bones. The wedding lace she had once guarded like treasure was now nothing more than a ragged memory, burned to ash in the hearth the first night she stayed. Her fingers, once soft as linen, hardened with rope burns and blisters. The sun browned her skin, the wind carved her cheeks. And still she worked, hauling water, feeding cattle, mending fences until her back ached and her lungs filled with dust. The Boone Ranch met her with quiet acceptance, as if the land itself recognized a survivor. Horses no longer shied at her approach. The cattle grew calm beneath her voice. Even Jed Boone, whose silence weighed more than words, began to leave a tin mug of coffee by her seat each morning, a gesture as close to praise as the old man could manage. Elias watched the change with a patience born of prairie life. At first it was admiration, the kind a rancher might feel for a foal learning to run. But admiration turned to something hotter, a steady simmer beneath the rhythm of work. He showed her how to loop a rope without blistering her palms, how to balance in the saddle when the ground pitched and rolled beneath a galloping horse. One evening, with the western sky streaked in copper and rose, he guided her onto the back of his chestnut mare. "Lean with her," he said, hand brushing hers as he adjusted the reins. The touch was brief, accidental, or so they told themselves, but it struck like flint against dry tinder. When the horse surged forward, her hair whipped across his face, smelling faintly of sweat and wild sage. Through endless days of labor and long nights of unspoken longing, the prairie stretched around them, both cruel and beautiful. The land gave no quarter to weakness, but in its harshness it offered a strange kind of freedom. Clara felt the last remnants of her old life, tea parlor manners, East Coast decorum, peel away like bark in a storm. Then came the lightning. It struck without warning on a late August afternoon, splitting the sky with a blinding crack. The smell of ozone rolled over the fields, followed by a sudden furious roar. Flames leapt from the dry wheat, racing with the speed of a runaway horse. "Fire!" Elias shouted, already sprinting toward the barn. The alarm spread in seconds. Jed emerged with buckets, his face grim beneath the lowering clouds. Clara grabbed a wet sack from the trough and followed Elias without hesitation. The air turned molten, smoke clawing her throat and stinging her eyes. The wheat hissed like a living thing as fire devoured stalk and seed, leaping fence lines and chasing the wind. Elias met her at the edge of the inferno, his face streaked with soot. "Stay back," he barked. "No," she coughed, swinging the wet sack against a burning fence post. Sparks burst like angry stars. Together they beat at the flames, running side by side through choking smoke and blistering heat. Their arms burned, lungs screamed, but neither faltered. The night stretched into a fevered blur. Buckets of water hauled from the creek. Wet burlap flung over fire, the desperate rhythm of men and women fighting to hold their ground against nature's fury. Clara's dress clung to her, soaked and singed, each movement tearing new blisters into her hands. At one point, a flaming beam crashed inches from her feet. Elias lunged, dragging her clear as the beam collapsed in a shower of sparks. "Watch yourself," he shouted, voice raw. "Keep fighting!" She shot back, eyes blazing despite the smoke. By the time the first gray light of dawn bled across the horizon, the fire lay smoldering, its roar replaced by the hiss of dying embers. Acres of wheat lay black and ruined, but the ranch still stood. Clara stumbled to the edge of the field and collapsed to her knees, chest heaving. Ash clung to her hair and streaked her face until she looked like a warrior risen from battle. Elias found her there, his own clothes scorched and soaked. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the world around them silent, except for the distant crackle of cooling earth. Her gray eyes burned brighter than any flame. His heart hammered a rhythm older than the prairie itself. Neither spoke. Words would have been too small, too fragile for the wild thing that had taken root between them. The silence stretched, louder than confession, carrying the unspoken vow of two souls who had faced the fire and found each other still standing. The evening sky bled red over the Montana plains, a horizon streaked with the color of warning. Heat still lingered from the day, clinging to the boards of Boone Ranch like a fever. Clara felt it in her chest, a restless pulse beneath the skin. Something was coming. The land itself seemed to know. The first sign was the tremor of hooves, faint at first, then building into a steady thunder. Dust plumed against the setting sun until the riders appeared, 5 silhouettes cut from the burning sky. At their head rode Calvin Rourke, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, a man who carried entitlement the way others carried guns. He reined in hard at the gate, the steel of his spurs flashing like small knives. "Clara May Hollis." His voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "You've cost me time and coin. I've come to collect what's mine." Clara stepped onto the porch, shoulders square despite the tremor in her knees. Her borrowed work dress whipped in the dry wind, ash-stained from the wheat fire. "You paid for a dowry," Rourke continued, his grin cruel. "I paid for you." "Papers signed. By contract, you're mine." The words dripped with venom and arrogance. The hired guns behind him chuckled low, hands brushing the grips of their pistols. Before Clara could speak, Elias moved. He crossed the yard with the calm inevitability of a storm, boots crunching gravel. His father's Colt hung heavy at his hip, but it was his eyes, hard as river stone, that stopped the laughter cold. "She belongs to no man," he said. Voice low but carrying, the space between them tightened like a drawn bowstring. Rourke's smile faltered into a snarl. "Step aside, boy, or I'll plant you where you stand." Jed Boone appeared on the porch then, rifle in hand. The old man said nothing, but the barrel pointed toward Rourke's heart was its own language. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The prairie wind stilled. Even the horses seemed to listen. Rourke's hand twitched toward his revolver. The crack of gunfire split the silence. Rourke drew first, but Elias was faster. He dropped low, Colt flashing in the blood-red light. The first shot tore a groove through Rourke's hat brim. The second kicked dirt at his boots. Bullets whined across the yard as hired guns fired wildly, sparks biting into the ranch fence. Clara ducked behind a hitching post, heart hammering. Smoke and dust mingled with the copper tang of fear. She glimpsed Elias rolling to cover, returning fire with deadly precision. Each shot was a punctuation mark of defiance. Jed's old rifle roared from the porch, the sound deep and final. One of Rourke's men tumbled from his saddle, screaming into the dirt. Another wheeled his horse and fled, spooked by the accuracy of an aging rancher who hadn't forgotten war. Rourke cursed, firing again. A splinter exploded inches from Clara's cheek. Adrenaline drowned her fear. She snatched a fallen pistol from the ground, cold iron slick with someone else's sweat, but held it tight though she never fired. Elias advanced through the haze, each step a silent promise. A shot from his Colt found the shoulder of another gunman, spinning him backward into the dust. The man howled and crawled for his horse. Now only Rourke remained, face twisted in disbelief. He raised his weapon once more, too slow. Elias fired. The report echoed like thunder across the empty plains. Rourke staggered, eyes wide, the pistol slipping from his grasp. He collapsed to his knees, then to the dirt, breath rattling in the gathering dusk. Blood spread dark across the dry earth, a cruel flower blooming beneath him. Silence fell, broken only by the restless whinny of horses and the fading crackle of cooling gun barrels. Clara rose slowly, dust ghosting around her like smoke. She stepped toward Rourke's body, each movement deliberate, as if crossing years of humiliation with every stride. The dying man stared up at her, lips working soundlessly. She stopped over him, shadow long in the blood-red light. The prairie wind lifted her hair like a banner. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low, carrying across the silent yard. Free. The single word floated into the evening air, weightless yet unbreakable. The hills caught it, rolling it outward until it became more than sound. A hymn carried by the wind, a promise to the land itself. Elias lowered his Colt, chest rising with the sharp rhythm of survival. Jed Boone stepped down from the porch, rifle resting against his shoulder, eyes softening just enough to reveal the father's blessing buried beneath the gun smoke. Clara met Elias's gaze. No contracts bound her now, No paper or promise could cage what had been forged in fire and dust. The horizon still bled with the last light of day. But in the cooling air she felt the first breath of a life she had claimed as her own. Autumn came to the prairie like a slow hymn, painting the grasslands with strokes of amber and rust. The wheat fields swayed in a golden hush, their tips catching the last warm light before winter. At the Boone Ranch, the air smelled of cut hay and wood smoke. Clara breathed it in each morning, a scent that belonged to belonging itself. Months had passed since gunfire split the horizon. In that time, Clara's presence had shifted from visitor to heartbeat. She rose with the sun to haul water, to mend fences, to bake biscuits that Jed Boone pretended not to like, but always finished. The house no longer echoed with loneliness. Even the walls seemed to lean inward, listening to the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed. Elias often found her at dusk on the porch, watching the sky catch fire and fade. They spoke little. Words felt too small for the slow-burning warmth that settled between them. Sometimes his hand brushed hers on the railing, a passing touch that carried the weight of a vow neither dared speak aloud. On a Sunday brushed with cool wind, the Boone family rode into town for the county fair. Wagons rattled along the dirt road, wheels humming a tune older than memory. Clara wore a simple blue dress and a shawl stitched by her own hands. The fabric whispered against her skin like a blessing. The fairground smelled of roasted corn and sweet cider. Children darted between booths, chasing dust devils that danced across the packed earth. A fiddler played near the hay bales, his melody bright and aching all at once. Townsfolk paused to watch as the Boone wagon arrived. Whispers traveled quick as prairie fire. "That's her," someone murmured. The bride who was left. But the words no longer carried pity, only a wary respect. Clara stepped down from the wagon, shoulders straight. The stairs slid off her like autumn light on water. She was no longer the crying girl on a train platform. She was something tempered, steel hidden beneath silk. Tommy, Elias's little brother, tugged free of Jed's grasp and ran ahead. The boy's boots kicked up a trail of golden dust as he bounded toward Clara. He stopped short, breathless, eyes wide with some secret discovery. "That's my mama," he said. The words were small, but they carried across the fair like a church bell at dawn. Clara froze, shawl slipping from her shoulders. The noise of the crowd dulled until only Tommy's declaration remained, bright and undeniable. Her heart stumbled, then steadied with a force that surprised her. No paper had named her so, no vows had been spoken, but in that moment the title fit as naturally as breath. Elias stepped forward, eyes fixed on hers. He didn't laugh. He didn't correct the boy. Instead, he reached for her hand, calloused fingers threading through hers with the surety of roots finding soil. Clara felt the world settle. The music swelled, fiddles climbing toward a tune older than sorrow. Around them, life bustled on. Children squealed at the pony rides. Vendors shouted prices. The smell of fried dough sweetened the cooling air. But within their small circle, time slowed to a tender stillness. Jed Boone watched from a few paces back, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. His eyes, once hard as river stones, softened as he tipped his head in silent acknowledgement. Whatever pain had once walled him off seemed to ease, brick by invisible brick. Tommy grinned up at Clara, oblivious to the weight of his words. "Mama," he repeated, testing the sound like a new melody. Clara knelt, the hem of her dress brushing the dusty ground. She cupped the boy's cheek, thumb tracing the smear of fairground candy near his mouth. A laugh trembled in her chest, caught between wonder and tears. "Well now," she whispered, voice rough with 1,000 unsaid things. "I reckon I'd like that." The boy beamed, satisfied with the truth he had named. As the sun leaned toward the western hills, a chill slipped through the fairgrounds. Lanterns flickered to life, their glow soft as candle prayers. Clara stood with Elias, their hands still joined. The prairie wind lifted her hair, carrying the scent of dry wheat and wood smoke, the scent of home. She thought of the station where it had all begun, the iron tracks, the hollow whistle of a departing train, the veil torn by prairie wind. That girl in white seemed like a ghost now, someone she might once have pitied but no longer recognized. Here beneath the fading autumn sky, she was no longer a bride waiting for rescue. She was a mother in a boy's bright eyes, a lover in a man's steady gaze. A woman forged in fire and forgiven by the endless land. The fiddler's tune rose again, twining through the evening air like a promise. Clara leaned into Elias, her head resting against his shoulder. Together they watched the prairie breathe, a wild, boundless thing, ready to hold whatever came next.